Is advice better because it's older? Are suggestions about how you should live your life more valid when they have survived for hundreds or thousands of years versus the latest fad from the self help aisle? This is the question I'd like to explore today, and I think it has interesting arguments on both sides. On the one hand, in favor of older advice is the idea that we as human beings are constantly generating new ideas. Societies are generating new ways of living, new strategies for success, as well as new ways of balancing our human nature. And these constantly innovating cycles are creating new ideas constantly, but at the same time, they're also culling ones that don't work. So, in a sort of pseudo evolutionary fashion, older ideas might be better because they have withstood this test of time. If an idea had survived from 1,000, 2,000 years ago to seem relevant today, there must be some deep wisdom behind it, versus something that might just be a temporary fad. Another reason that older ideas might have this claim on being superior wisdom is that older ideas also say something about human nature. So if you believe that societies as well as individuals have not changed so radically over time, that human nature has remained the same, and so the struggles that Greeks faced 2,000 years ago or the Indians faced 2,500 years ago around the time of the Buddha, that if those human problems are the same as the human problems we face today, then there is a reasonable claim that people who discovered solutions then would also have solutions for our modern times. However, I'd like to also talk about what might be wrong with this perspective and why you might want to favor new ideas. So one reason is the belief in progress. So it's well understood that science progresses, that we know more about the universe now than we did before, and that also applies to human nature. We know more about psychology than we did in Freud's time, and certainly we know more than we did in Aristotle's. And in this sense, because we have been changing what our understanding is of ourselves and in the world that we live in, as our ideas have progressed and become more accurate, we can also offer more accurate advice. The Buddha believed that the human body was composed of discrete elements, like the Greeks, of fire, earth, water, and air, whereas we now know that it's actually chemical elements and that there are hundreds of them. So this kind of progress may seem superficial, but if you base your ideas on a less scientific understanding of the world, is it not surprising that you may lead to incorrect conclusions about what kind of advice you should follow? What about moral progress? After all, it is probably the case that we are now living in a more moral and ethical time than in the past. Slavery, spousal abuse, child abuse, genocide, all of these things were common in ancient times, and even if they were not applauded by the writers and thinkers who were living in those eras, they were often accepted in a way that we would not accept them today. For instance, in the Bible, they talk about having slaves and committing atrocities, which today just sound incredibly callous and immoral in our current ears, even if the people who were thinking of it at the time didn't see them that way. So even if you believe that moral progress doesn't happen, that we just have this sort of relativist set of standards, that today we think X is right and Y is wrong, and yesteryears they believed some different set of moral scruples, that even if you believe there isn't moral progress, we still live in our modern society with our current modern set of ethics and morals. And so wouldn't it make sense to read from authors who combine their advice within our current societal expectations of what is the right thing to do and what is the right thing to value? So I think both of these arguments hold some weight. And I think another factor that's important to consider of why older advice sometimes attracts some prestige, why someone who reads Marcus Aurelius or who reads the original Pali Canon from the Buddha, why someone reading this might attract some praise that they might otherwise not. And this is also because I think reading harder books is also a status signal. If you read Shakespeare, it's not merely that Shakespeare is better work, but the kind of person who reads Shakespeare, who's going to sit through a book written in a version of English that's hard to understand and difficult to parse, is going to have a certain intellectual curiosity, a certain cultural view of the world. And so this positive qualities of the reader sometimes get attributed to the work itself. So again, the kind of person who's going to patiently go through an ancient text to derive wisdom might themselves be a more deliberate and thoughtful person than someone who's only going to pick up a book if it is a modern self-help title. And so this status signal component, I think, is very difficult to extricate from this initial problem of, is older advice better? Because if reading older advice is a good signal of your intellectual capabilities, it might seem like the advice itself is what's good rather than just the type of people who tend to read it. So I think all of these arguments are valid. I think that old advice sometimes does serve as a status signal where people can pride themselves on having read some ancient classic. I think that older ideas have survived the test of time and through this pseudo-evolutionary fashion have lasted longer than a lot of modern ideas, which may turn out to be fads. I also believe in progress, both scientific and moral, and I think that it is the case that the world we live in today is different from the world that was written about in the past, and without a modern interpretation, many ideas simply don't hold. However, I think the solution to all of this is to just read both, to read modern ideas and understand that the people who are espousing those ideas may be wrong. They may be fads. They may be something fickle and temporary rather than enduring and wise. In the same vein, we must also read older classics and realize that the world they lived in was different. They didn't have access to the same scientific understanding we do now, nor even perhaps the same moral compass and expectations that guide our current efforts. So I want to know what you think. Do you think that it's better to read more from older classics from hundreds or thousands of years ago, or should we stick to modern works that synthesize these things? I'm interested in hearing your thoughts in the comments, and let me know.